Welcome to Presidential Fight Club, the show that answers the question, if all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Well, welcome everyone to the first fight of the semifinals. We have Andrew Jackson facing off against James Monroe, two presidents from the early 19th century, rough and tumble. Let's rumble. James, what does Andrew Jackson bring to the fight?
Well, let's go back and talk about Andrew Jackson's childhood. I mean, he was a fighter from day one, pretty much. His father was out of the picture from a very early age, and his mom died when he was 14. And as a result, he anticipated death around every corner and was prepared to fight at any moment, which he did. As we mentioned when we talked about Andrew Johnson, a different Tennessee president, obviously, it was there was a social stigma attached to being an orphan, although I know there were plenty of orphans running around because people got sick and died so frequently and so early in life. But he was often picked on by bullies, and so he would come home with bruises and scars and scrapes, and he was basically famous for being in fights every single day, and over time he usually ended up winning those fights. So he was very proficient with his fists by the time he was a mid-teenager. When he was 13, he decided he wanted to fight the British. He was born in 1767, so 1780. This was in the South. Of course, he was born right around the border of South Carolina, North Carolina. We don't really know which state he would have been in if the states were the way they are today, but somewhere around that area. And there's a story that tells about how he was captured by British soldiers. He was taken as a prisoner of war along with his brother. And one of his captors ordered him to shine his boots, and he refused. And so the soldier pulled out a sword and tried to bring it down on Jackson's head, and Jackson raised his arm and deflected the sword, and he got cut on the arm, and he got a gash down his cheek. And then, he fought back. He wasn't going to take any crap off of anybody, basically. He was good with offense and good with defense. He was forced to march shoeless, with his wound undressed, without food or water, and full of bright and shiny hatred for 40 miles from one prison camp to another. And by the way, did I mention that he had smallpox during this time? He was suffering from disease. He was barefoot. It was just not in a good situation. He just had a chip on his shoulder, and he hated the British for the rest of his life. And there were a lot of people he hated. He did not really care much for Indians. He did not like British. He did not like the Spanish. And he constantly was signing up for military service. He fought in the War of 1812. He was continuing the army after the war and fought Indians, and basically single-handedly stole Spain from the Spanish. He just decided, I want Spain. I don't care what the president says. So against orders, he goes in and basically captures Spain for the United States. Later, it was formally ceded in the Adams-Onís Treaty of 1819. So Jackson was tough. You mentioned in your segment on Jackson earlier about how he fought a lot of duels. I'll mention one in particular. He fought a man in 1806 named Charles Dickinson, and Dickinson was widely known as a good shot, but Jackson said, you go ahead and fire first. It wouldn't be fair for me to fire first. It'd just be over too quickly. So he lets Dickinson fire, and Dickinson hits him in the chest, missing the heart just barely. And Jackson just calmly pulls out his gun and fires and shoots Dickinson dead. So this man was a beast. He could dish it out and he could take it. He's one of the toughest presidents we've ever had.
Okay, well, I have my work cut out for me. James Monroe. Now, in defense of him, he's no pushover. As we talked about before, the Monroe Doctrine of Pain. He will not allow Europe to come over and colonize America, and he will not allow any other foe to take him out. He was a major in the Continental Army in the American Revolutionary War. He was sturdily built with broad shoulders. He's a little over 6 feet high. But I'm not going to argue on his behalf as if he would go toe-to-toe with Jackson. So I accept what James said, that Jackson, by every account, was tough. And if it's just a toe-to-toe fight, Monroe won't win. So I'm going to use a more desperate gambit, kind of like sending Frodo into Mordor with the One Ring and try to destroy it. It's completely desperate, but you can see no other way of victory. So the way that I see victory of Monroe over Jackson isn't over fighting, but over personality. A book by William D. Gregorio called The Complete Book of U.S. Presidents has a description of Monroe's personality, and he describes him as follows, and I think this has particular application to Jackson. He says, Monroe's greatest asset was his disarming, warm personality. Although conceding that Monroe lacked brilliance and a nimble mind, biographer Harry Amon pointed out that he had, quote, a rare ability of putting men at ease by his courtesy, his lack of condescension, his frankness, and by what his contemporaries looked upon as his essential goodness and kindness of heart. Monroe at least partially overcame an early shyness, but remained markedly low-key and reserved, especially among strangers. So this is what I can say with Jackson, that as other people commented, as Thomas Jefferson and Martin Van Buren and others commented that he had a fiery temper that could very well put America in danger, it would take someone with a large degree of charisma, EQ, let us say, to be able to manage someone and even psychologically manipulate him during the fight, being the good cop. And if Jackson softens up a little bit, then Monroe can lay in and sucker punch him and maybe hit the place where one of his old duel wounds are located and take him out. So that's my strategy. That is my taking the One Ring into Mordor and seeing if it works. Does it work? Is Monroe victorious over Jackson?
Well, what's good enough for Frodo Baggins is not necessarily good enough for James Monroe, I'm sorry to say. This is a good battle. You know, if this were really going on, Monroe would give as good as he got, but Jackson is just simply too fierce, too aggressive, too angry, and too, he didn't have that nice, calm personality that Monroe had. Although Jackson could tone it down. I mean, he could control his temper when he needed to, but Jackson just is too experienced with fighting. He's just too aggressive, and he can take a punch and he can dish it out. So he's going to beat Monroe. It'll take several rounds, but he will take Monroe down.
And because there's so much to say about how fierce Jackson is, there's a great quote from Thomas Jefferson that he says to Daniel Webster. I think this is in 1824. And he said, I feel much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson president. He's one of the most unfit men I know for such a place. He has very little respect for laws and constitutions and is, in fact, an able military chief. His passions are terrible. When I was president of the Senate, he was senator, and he could never speak on account of the rashness of his feelings. I have seen him attempt it repeatedly and often choke with rage. He is a dangerous man. So there you go.
Very dangerous. Jefferson knows what he's talking about.
Okay, well, let's see how dangerous Jefferson is, because we're going to see him go up against Washington in the second fight of the semifinals. He definitely has his work cut out for him. See you there. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.